America's legacy is built on revolution. The First Amendment, that protects our rights to protest and free speech, is cited by some as our most important amendment. As Americans, we are proud of our revolutionary roots. So what changes in the face of actual public dissent? In late August of 1968, progressives from across the country gathered in Chicago to demonstrate outside of the Democratic National Convention. Groups like the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, or MOBI, and the Youth International Party, or the Yippies, came to Chicago to show the world their disdain for the war, the Democratic Party, and American society in general. What followed was a week of protest and police violence. Leaders of these organizations, like David Dellinger, Tom Hayden, and Abbie Hoffman, had been planning this trip for nearly a year, and Chicago Mayor Richard Daley knew this. A 1968 New York Times article from just 2 days before the demonstrations began reports on Daley's preparation, saying, "At the request of Mayor Richard J. Daley, the governor ordered 5,649 Illinois National Guardsmen to round-the-clock duty in Chicago beginning Friday." Meanwhile, an Army spokesman in Washington confirmed in a telephone interview that about 6,000 regular Army troops received rigorous riot control training at Fort Hood, Texas last week as a precautionary measure. That's over 11,000 soldiers, not counting the entire Chicago police force that Daley also tasked with shifts of 24-hour surveillance over the protesters. However, the large police and military presence in the city only stoked the fire of frustrated feelings that brought the protesters to Chicago in the first place. The demonstrations began in earnest on August 22nd, after 17-year-old Dean Johnson and another boy who had been out past curfew were stopped by a Chicago PD officer. Johnson pulled out a pistol which misfired at the officer. Dean Johnson was shot and killed by that officer, and a memorial protest occurred the same day. The next day began the week of planned protests and demonstrations, 2 of the biggest being the Festival of Life Music Festival, organized by the Yippies and held in Lincoln Park on August 25th, and the so-called Battle for Michigan Avenue, that occurred on August 28th and became the face of the convention. Contemporary journalist Neil Steinberg describes it as a 17-minute melee in front of the Conrad Hilton, broadcast on TV, interspersed with the action on the floor of the convention. That night was the same night that Hubert Humphrey won the presidential nomination, so the events were heavily covered by media outlets. The Battle for Michigan Avenue is where the now famous chant, "The whole world is watching," originated, as Americans were getting a front row seat to the violence happening at the convention. But despite all this, the majority of the American public still believed that the police's actions were justified. Years later, journalist Barbara Ehrenreich references public opinion on the riots, saying, "Polls taken immediately after the convention showed that the majority of Americans, 56%, sympathized with the police, not with the bloodied demonstrators or the press." On September 9th, Mayor Daley held a press conference defending the actions of the city, where he claimed that the media was falsely portraying the actions of the authorities and announced that he would be releasing an hour-long TV special detailing the events of the week from the point of view of the Chicago PD. For the most part, Daley's strategy worked. In his article, Steinberg also references a public opinion poll stating, "A major poll 2 months after the convention found that more people thought that the police had used too little force than too much, 25 to 19%. This is because the special portrayed the protesters as political extremists, using buzzwords like hardcore revolutionaries and menacing mob. Even when faced with the reality of police brutalizing citizens like themselves, the American public felt more inclined to defend the police than the so-called radical protesters." After the special was aired, the New York Times published a response to it, hinting at the reality behind it. It features a response from David Dellinger, the chairman of MOBI, who was there at the convention. He said that the film was filled with inaccuracies and false innuendos, and that it exposes the Chicago PD for planting officers amongst the protesters and spying on their meetings. Essentially, all reports on the riots, including Daley's TV special, did nothing more than further the rift in the American people. Those who believed Daley only felt validated in their beliefs, and those who believed the protesters could easily see through Daley's lies, and so the American public stood divided. In September of 2020, the trial of the Chicago 7, directed by Aaron Sorkin, was released. The film depicts the events of the 1968 Democratic National Convention through the lens of the highly publicized court case that occurred 2 years later. The scenes that viewers saw on screen were all too familiar after the protests that broke out across the country following the killing of George Floyd by a Michigan police officer. The summer of 2020 was a result of tension that had been building since the inception of the Black Lives Matter movement after the 2013 killing of Trayvon Martin, and the murder of George Floyd was the breaking point. Protests broke out all over the country, with protesters making demands for racial equality and defunding of the police. Unfortunately, just like in 1968, these protests soon became violent affairs. Also like the 1968 riots, the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement was highly publicized, even more so with the ever-growing presence of social media. Social media began to override traditional news outlets, and it became a major outlet for young people to both learn about the movement and to show their support. Infographics like the one here from Impact on Instagram were a common sight across platforms. This post explains to the viewer how mainstream media portrays a mostly peaceful movement as one of violence, stating that 42% of people in a poll believed that Black Lives Matter protesters were aiming to incite violence. Social media and news coverage of protests presented two distinct but familiar narratives, one of police-incited violence and one of degenerate protesters. After 55 years, the American public remains antagonistic towards activists, especially those whom they do not agree with. And in a modern age where any and every event is depicted with any and every bias, these antagonistic feelings only grow stronger. So yes, the whole world is watching, but who and what are they seeing?